Greetings, this is Saint Sir Nicholas. If you like what you learn here, or anything else on my channel, please consider giving this video a like, sharing it, commenting, maybe even subscribing. When one thinks of elves, the noble Sir, the brutal Druki, or the enigmatic Azrai, something that is likely to come to mind is how well militarized their societies are. Nobles are trained for battle, there are wide ranges of professional units, wizards abound, and every normal elf can be called upon to take up spear and shield for Ulthuan and its holdings, don her plate and serve as a bleak sword, or rain arrows on behalf of his kinband. But was this always the case? Today we will be delving into the question of how large were elf armies before the Sundering, the horrific civil war that split the greatest species, as well as touching on some of those they fought with and against. First, though, a few notes on methodology. Spoilers for all Sundering stories will be present in the series, some nuances of plot to character, as well as the outcomes of pivotal events. Unless otherwise stated, all analysis is made in the context of a non-end times timeline, consider Guardians of the Forest. Moreover, due to a lack of extant historical images, depictions of modern units will be used for illustrative purposes, not least because the technology in Way of War was similar back then. Finally, the historical record is, in many places, limited or non-existent, not least regarding where the survivors of certain campaigns were later used. As such, certain statistics will be vague or simply unavailable. Additionally, the estimates are just that, estimates, guessworks grounded in the sources, and seeing similar relative things, but ultimately only an effort to apply math to ancient history. After the death of Anarion, Bel-Shan-ar was chosen as the next king of elves instead of Anarion's son, Malekith, also known as Maleron, on the grounds that his father's character flaws were in him, and since the new ever Queen of the Elves, who the king is supposed to wed for at least a year, was his half-sister and refused to consider marrying him. Despite his mother Morathi's objections and his own interest in rulership, Malekith accepted this, being the first to kneel before his king. The Nagarythe prince soon became restless and, desiring to achieve glory and greatness, led a fleet east. He had 13 ships with 1,000 knights, 1,000 archers, and 4,000 spearmen. All his warriors had at least a century of training, as was required to be part of Nagarythe's army. Though, in an ironic twist of fate, Malekith himself was less than 100 years old when he fought alongside his father during the battle to protect the elf wizards who made the Great Vortex and save Malus from chaos. The prince soon came to Athel Torlarion under siege by the Greenskins, recently abandoned by Prince Aeniron, who used his fleet to take his 10,000 spearmen away, leaving a few hundred soldiers under Captain Lorhier and the civilians behind due to a lack of space on his ships. Against the sea had come a great greenskin host. They had 6 fire catapults, many ladders, and unfinished war machines, and so many warriors that they could have defeated the 10,000 spearmen. Still, Malekith landed and cleared the saved Greenskins, and by the arrows and Malekith's lightning, those outside the walls were pressured. The prince agreed to save the sea if they agreed to be annexed by him. Lorhier accepted. As some Nagarythe fell to stone throwers and choppas, the elves pushed the invaders back, shooting hundreds and trampling hundreds more, to say nothing of those killed by spears. Malekith himself showed his power by flying on wings of magic to halt a breach, gathering power, blazing around himself, and crashing down to kill dozens or maybe hundreds in an explosion, then humiliated and killed the war boss. Soon thereafter, the Greenskins were crushed. Only 476 of the city's soldiers and civilians survived the siege, and shortly thereafter, Morathi was able to get Bel-Shan-ar to recognize the right of conquest of her son on the grounds that if a ruler abandons a colony to destruction, it is fair play for another elf lord to seize it and take care of its people. This new precedent brought concern, since Keldor and Nagarythe at the time had large armies but the other realms were lacking. Malekith would soon find the Dwarfs. Though he was initially disdainful towards them, he soon realized the value of an alliance. Malekith was impressed by them once he got to understand them, even going on a successful troll hunt with High King Story and admitting that Garazakarak was the only province-like entity that could match Nagarythe's military might. Soon the two peoples would join forces against evil. Malekith attached himself and a company of soldiers, archers, and spearmen to High King Snorri's host. This included crossbow regiments, many war engines such as bolt throwers such as Wolfspear, what appears to have been a runesmith, and the majority of the dwarf army was melee infantry, almost 2/3 of the host. This united force fought against a Beastmen army, a mighty horde made up mostly of Gors with minotaurs and a brave shaman. A giant throwing stones is also used, but it is impossible to know if this was a Cygor or just a normal giant. The Beastmen suffered heavy losses to ranged attacks, and a few were blown up when their brave shaman was killed off by a demon betraying him and making him suffer a fatal explosive miscast. But not before the shaman's spell disarmed many of the elf spearmen by corroding their weapons, or did worse to them. Malekith and his spearmen, which he maneuvered to save the dwarves from a new threat, were set upon by dozens of goblins on wolves who attacked the elves, perishing along with much of the second wave, and a swarm of small greenskins on foot also perished, the few goblins who fled getting hunted down and slain. Hundreds of beastmen, made with javelins, revealed themselves in a flanking attack and wiped out many of the war engines. The wolf spear was saved and used to shoot a second giant the greenskins brought in as part of their trap. As Malekith and his warriors destroyed Ungors at the back of the bestial army, victory seemed near. Then a dragon ogre Shaggoth, almost the size of a dragon, entered the fray. The monster slew many elves and injured Malekith. However, the son of Anarion ended the creature with the help of the High King, attacking the monster from the flank. Despite the forces of good significant losses, especially among the dwarf infantry, as well as many elves, of whom 19 corpses were recovered and some were horribly wounded, this was a significant victory against evil. Over the next 1,000 years, the forces of good would prosper. Elf and sometimes dwarf armies would crush orcs and goblins, as well as the beastmen and other forces of chaos, making them rendered down to hollow shadows of their old power. Despite the string of victories, this was not without danger, as shown by how Malekith's white dragon perished at a giant's hands during the last great battle to secure the colonies. Only the dwarfs could maybe rival the might of the elf armies in the old world. Malekith's army at this point is hard to get a grasp on, but it is known that he had less than 400,000 warriors. He had dozens of castles and countless spearmen, archers, and knights. The greatest gathering of his warriors in this era was put on for the awe of the king, which was done when the king came to visit the colonies. Belshazzar's guard and allies from Tirnoch were utterly outclassed and outnumbered by the 200,000 soldiers Malekith displayed, which was the strongest host ever assembled to date in the world. Though it bears mentioning not the largest, as in the days before the Great Vortex there had once been armies of millions of demons. At least 5,000 of Malekith's soldiers were his knights, and they with Belshazzar went to meet Snorri, who brought 500 kings and thanes as well as rune lords and master engineers to the gathering. So was the meeting of the kings held in illustrious company. Malekith would later grow bored and take ship north with 500 companions, defeating barbaric humans and then facing other chaos worshippers with bronze equipment, wizards, and were gifted magical items by the dark gods. The elves won, of course, but over time Malekith's party was dwindled down to fewer than 100. At this time he found the Circlet of Iron, a relic of incredible power that allowed him to see from afar distant lands and even peer into the realm of chaos and briefly see the chaos gods without going insane or falling to their worship, though only just. Towards the end of the Great Age of Peace, two of the most instructive and well-documented lives of elves at war are those of Helebron and Imric. Helebron is the daughter of Prince Elandrian, who was made the master of the city of Athol Toraline. In the colonies there were few wizards, but the worship of Cain was prevalent. Helebron was drawn to a cult meeting where hundreds of elves praised the god of murder. Then she and her sister Lyrith joined the army. They served as spear infantry along thousands of other elves, and took part in defeating a Beastmen army in their first battle. For the next score of years, she served, at times alongside small armies from other elf colony cities, and at this time, it was said that she and her sister killed 1,000 in battle and at sacrifices. In this time, the soldiers she was with had about in a third turned to worshipping Cain rituals, but the elf siblings were held back from becoming the great priestesses they could be. The army Helebron was with was thousands strong at this critical juncture, comprised of 4,000 spearmen, regiments of bowmen, some soldiers with crossbows, and with bolt throwers with their crews, as well as knights. Near Nehekara, this host eventually faced down somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Greenskins, which was considered to be a small army and expected to be from at least 12 different tribes. It had a mix of wolf riders, many dozen orcs on boars, 12 trolls, a catapult, some sort of champion on a wyvern, and of course swords of orcs and goblins. At the start of the battle, Helebron and Lyrith seized their mentor and got the prince in command of the army to kill him, removing the one holding them back, and then they fought as the first death hags and reaped many foes. The battle, naturally, went the way of the elves, who are documented as killing hundreds of goblins, destroying the boar riders and many other units, and slaying the wyvern. 200 of the Greenskins were captured and sacrificed as well. As a result of their great victory and brutal displays of violence, thousands of Athol Toraline's people came to worship Cain. Soon, religious tensions turned quite deadly in the city, and Helebron and her sibling led 50 other cultists into the pleasure cult's temple and murdered hundreds of them. A counter-riot saw more than 100 of Helebron's people and 50 other cultists die. In her next riot, Helebron's violent inducement cost hundreds of lives. Having had enough, her father sent 100 knights and rank upon rank of spearmen and archers to arrest the Cain worshippers, with the sisters imprisoned outside of the city. Another elf who was active at this time was Imric, not the one who might be the successor to Finnebur. This is another elf who had the same name thousands of years ago. He fought in the Eastern lands, and interestingly, the Tracens were used by Imric in the Colony Wars to get rid of monsters sometimes. In his last battle before the Dark Times came, he and two of his kin led the host, each on a dragon. These 3 dragons with their riders had an army of 2,000 knights, 4,500 spearmen, 20 dual bolt thrower carts, which required 4 horses to pull. It's worth explaining, however, that these were not war wagons, just a means of transporting the bolt throwers into position to be assembled. Moreover, there were 3,000 archers whose arrows were tipped with white magical flame, but it's unknown if there was a wizard who was tasked with making this so. Alongside these almost 10,000 Kaldorians and 3 dragons, there were Nagarythe, who also came to the battle, over 12,000 soldiers, that being 8,000 foot troops, 4,000 knights, an unclear number of war engines with crew, and they were led by Mal Daiar, a prince on a griffin. The 2 commanders of the armies had quarreled, but through their disagreements, not least over who should get which lands, taken from the Greenskins, and the natural rivalry between these 2 great factions of elves, they were able to work together, such as a moment where the Nagarythe knights had already lost some of their number to greenskin shooting and would have been utterly crushed by the orcs if not for the dragons. And ultimately, the elves were victorious, overcoming goblin wolf riders, orc boar riders who fell in their hundreds, masses of goblins shot by the archers, and war boss on a wyvern who was killed by a dragon and rider. Only some hundreds of the enemy were able to escape, with the wounded greenskins either executed by the Kaldorians, while the Nagarythe captured the injured greenskins they could get to and sacrificed them. When the cults, mostly made of Nagarythe dedicated to the elf underworld gods, came into prominence by committing atrocities, many of the elf kingdoms drew together forces to put down the corruption in Nagarythe. During this time, Morathi effectively did whatever she wanted as the Nagarythe queen. Malekith, now aware of the full power of the ruinous powers and eager to gain more power, returned. He was disgusted by the cults and widely considered the best leader of elves, so made the commander of this united force. A clear sign of Morathi's oppression was when a messenger called Helio Coran came to the manor of House Anar, a noble family in Nagarythe that would not buy into Morathi's behavior and give her fealty. When this became clear to the envoy, he let in 36 soldiers who set about butchering the Anar's guests. Ulthuan and his father and grandfather were able to kill the soldiers, and the dark diplomat was shot as he rode away. Indeed, every kingdom had cults that they fought and had to be killed, and before the first march on Morathi could take place, the wicked were getting this opening, since all the best generals and soldiers had left for the colonies. After Malekith returned, many cities in Kalador had new uprisings of cults. A low estimate, say only 3 instances across the 8 relevant kingdoms, and with numbers alike the later rebellion in Lothran, would yield 6,000 cultists at least, who of course were defeated by local authorities. But the forces of good were not idle. Perhaps most impressively, the brother and sister rulers of Eliron had 20,000 riders and 10,000 spearmen ready to go in time for the war. On the other hand, owing to enmity towards Malekith and refusal to obey his orders, the kingdom of Kalador sent no troops, but, to not be found wanting, donated some magic weapons. The good elves mustered a host of probably over 12,000 warriors for what would be the Elaith campaign. Malekith led 600 knights, 300 Tirnoch chariots, 700 Reaver knights from Eliron, 10,000 spearmen drawn from Etain and Yvres, supported by 100 super wagons full of supplies, as well as laborers and priests. At least 4 of these priests were wizards, 2 Lord of Heavens users who worshipped Lilith, and 2 unknown war diviners, but these wizards and their associates appear to have been quite useless, irrelevant even. Malekith led 100 riders as well as a Raven Herald to fight a cult stronghold. Some of the warriors were killed by the cultists they found, but it was an easy victory. Still, this came at a shocking price, not in blood but in revelation. The leader of cults was found to be Morathi, Malekith's mother and the mightiest living elf wizard. At the same time, the Anars marched against Morathi. Prince Eloran Anar, his son, Prince Eloith Anar, and his son, Prince Alith Anar, led an army of 20,000 elves, with many spear companies and thousands of archers. They had no riders and it seems no wizards, other than Alith, who knew a tiny amount of sorcery. The elder Anars would lead the bulk of the host, while Alith led 500 archers. Towards the end of the battle, hundreds of Illyrians on horseback under Alatan arrived, these being sent from Malekith's army. Against the Asur, the Druki had encamped a large army, which was spotted by Alith in part due to a Raven Herald's guidance. The evil elves had 30 campfires, 2 of which were quite large, while the army's commander An elf known only as the Herald of Cain, a male death hag in all but name, claimed his troops were more numerous. This appears to have been at best an error, or an outright lie on his part, since his soldiers were comprised of 5,000 professional spearmen with some archers, and at least 10,000 cultists. Like the Inars, they did not seem to have any wizards, though the Herald of Cain did have magical weapons and special powers bestowed on him. His obvious command role made him a prime target for capture. Aleth's scouts drew 1,000 of the spearmen and archers off, while the main parts of the armies clashed and shot dozens of them, for several losses in return to arrows. Whole waves of cultists were shot to death, but thousands made melee contact under a red mist the priest evoked using his own blood and the divine powers of his god, that all but blinded the good elves, making them unable to aim their bows. The cultists were joined by more evil spearmen. The Herald of Cain in particular tore through the soldiers of Halthanar, but Prince Elthrohir severed one of his hands, and an elf called Canthras, a champion of the Asur army, impaled him with a magic spear that surged flames through his body, blasting the Herald of Cain to bits. As the fighting ground on, a group of riders appeared. After a brief scuffle with Eleth's scouts, they were revealed as the Illyrians under An-El-Tain, hundreds of Reavers and Reaver Knights. Their commander stated that his force had already destroyed a group of Druchii Knights. Exact numbers are impossible to attach, but perhaps at least 500 and no more than 1,000, since they could have won the battle for Morathi's side, but were destroyed by the Asur riders. The smaller numbers favored on account of the Asur victory, as well as how the Illyrians were considered a deadly danger to the Inars until their true role became clear. The Illyrians also brought word that Morathi's trap had tens of thousands of soldiers and cultists poised to attack Malekith. In the wake of the victory of House Anar and the other loyal elves, losses on both sides are unclear. However, House Anar seems to have suffered about 7,000 slain, as their future army would reflect this drop in warriors. Morathi's two contingents for this battle here seem to have been utterly laid low, so perhaps upward of 16 or 17,000 fell. Malekith, almost immediately after discovering that his own mother had fallen, learned his position was untenable, since most of the Nagarythe soldiers had gone over to Morathi, as well as some Raven Heralds. He led his troops to Galthir, where his personal fleet was kept. On the way, he destroyed an army of several thousand cultists. Galthir was hollowed out by a cult uprising they had put down, and attacked the forces of the evil Nagarythe under the Kir and Duran, under Prince Carandion, that being Torel Lyran's army. But it was repelled, and the city stood true, thanks in large part to the Isha healers they had. Malekith evacuated his army on 3 dragon ships and 7 hawk ships. Though the chariots in his army were all burned, they could not be brought along. 3 more hawk ships were sent out to screen away any attacks directed at the fleet, and Tiranoc also had ships that sailed forth. Later, Malekith would be reinforced by several dragon ships and Lothran Sea Guard units, solidifying naval dominance over Morathi's limited fleet, and in preparation for the next phase of the war, Tiranoc sent an army to distract Morathi, which she answered with a host that stared them down. Galthir's force remained trapped by a containment force, and Morathi had other armies, some of which were used to vaguely siege the Inars over winter. Most of the colony soldiers across the sea in the east were kept on that continent since orcs rose up and attacked. As such, a picture of approximately the sizes of the forces used in the campaign can be gleaned. The Asur clearly had over 62,000 warriors, and if the sizes of the known hosts of the Sarah are an indication, then perhaps the 20,000 soldiers the Inars mustered and the over 12,000 that Malekith had, the nearly 30,000 known Illyrians not sound at first, the forces of good had perhaps no more than 10,000 soldiers guarding Malekith's fleet and twice as many part of the Distraction Army, leading to an estimated total of probably maybe around 72,000 soldiers deployed in or around the combat zone, plus the Sea Guard and the vessel's crew. The two sides then waited as winter came, and each faction maneuvered and plotted. Not least, Malekith used the Circlet of Iron to spy on the traitor queen of Nagarythe. Additionally, Malekith swore that anyone who recanted could be spared. The Asur posted armies around the traitor lands, such as to the south, to distract Morathi. We know, for example, that thousands of Morathi soldiers were sent towards Tiranoc to counter the supposed attack from that way. Raven Heralds were used to attack Druchii companies on the move and burn crops. The Malekith led a thrust towards Anlec. On the way, Airi Tonrainir's garrison was beaten by Malekith's army in a single day. The son of Anarian's army comprised thousands upon thousands of knights, of spearmen, and archers, at least in excess of 35,000 soldiers. The exact number is not quite clear, but was greater than what Malekith had led in hundreds of years to war, and was a scale greater than any gathering of warriors Ulthuan had ever seen, the forces of good seeming to be endless when he looked at them from Anlec. Malekith himself considered it unlike any force since his father's time. In addition to Malekith, the great general and spellcaster, there were at least 5 princes and princesses from Nagarythe, Tiranoc, Illyrian, and Tain. as well as the sorcerer prince of Safri, Thyrol, and his two fellow mages, Mirnir and Eleneth, the trio of wizards from Safri, all riding Pegasi. The true master of Nagarythe personally led 200 knights, with 7,000 of his spearmen under Yaser. Malekith's imported colony troops included crossbowmen who used pavases. Moreover, Prince Fundarel and Princess Altheli directly led 2,000 of their people. Balthanair of Yvres rode upon Redclaw, both wounded by arrows during the battle, the Griffin later killed by Cararion, and Balthanair led 2,000 soldiers. Some chariots were part of this force. Then there was Charl, a Cherace prince and his 4-line chariot, his son with a banner, and other nobles on chariots, and some light lions. Moreover, Prince Eleran Anar, his son and grandson, and 30 of House Anar's shadows infiltrated the city. On the way there, they slaughtered a camp of 200 addled cultists and had to talk through a patrol of several dozen evil spearmen. Anlec was defended by a vast force. Morathi herself reigned and had 4 wizards, 2 male and 2 female, who she kept aloof from the fight, as well as another male wizard she sacrificed to Kairos Fateweaver in a bargain just before the fighting started. Therefore, direct command of the battle was more dealt with by the prince himself, a Lore of Beasts wizard, armed with the last king's lance and mounted on a manticore. Princes on steeds and priests with knives guided the defense. Regiments of professional soldiers formed a minority of the defenders, with most of the troops being on the outer walls, not inside to contain breaches, and most of the Druki soldiers, in fact, were merely cultists. The northern wall once had hundreds of soldiers, but they were sent off towards Tirnok. Still, hundreds of Druki did guard the gates, with dozens on each gatehouse armed with war engines. The defenders were not just elves, however. Manticores, griffins, 2 hydras, chimeras, mutated bears, big snakes, 2-headed monsters known as orthresses, as well as bonkanons, and a wolf thing whose eyes glowed and whose fangs were like iron, were all gathered. A very rough estimate, from considering the departure of some forces and the scale of fortifications, will be that Anlec's normal garrison was perhaps 5,000 at least, at most 15,000, with perhaps the real number being around 11,000 professional and more cultists than normal troops, so 5 to 15,000 cultists at least, so perhaps around 25,000 actual defenders in the field, or on the wall, and thereabouts as the case actually was. This number seems to be in line with what would be about 50 years later, where the host of Anlec was comprised of around 30,000 soldiers. Therefore, perhaps around 30,000 troops, the majority for certain being cultists, is a reasonable assessment. And what of the city itself? Well, it was a walled place. The fires of its forges were often heated with magic and had tens of thousands of inhabitants, with 80 towers plus other bastions, 20 castle-like towers on the walls, and there were 100 banners. A ring of towers, each with 100 soldiers, also guarded the ways in, each of the 3 gates, keeping watch over the city's moat, which was made of green fire, and each of the gates was guarded with 2 towers. As such, it was clear to the Asur that thousands would die in the battle to take the city. The Anar snuck into the city just before Malekith arrived, and during the battle at the gate that they would attack, the defenders were whittled down to just a few dozen guards who were quickly slain by the stealthy elves. Malekith charged forward at the start of the battle, using his magic and the circlet of iron to raise up part of the moat, turning the fire black, and then with a great effort he assumed to have killed anyone else, hurling it all to bathe 2 towers in a disintegrating blaze that completely destroyed the defenders. The advance through the gate suffered high losses. 1,000 elves did die, and soon a third of Ysir's spearmen were dead or wounded. And once inside, a big chunk of the remaining unit was destroyed by a Hydra's fire breath, and then even more fell to the melee prowess of the Hydra. Lion chariots were shattered by the beast as well. Yvres lost a trio of chariots as well to a Hydra, and inside the walls, Ysir's remaining warriors and Prince Finadel and Princess Atheli led 1,000 of their riders, and this force impacted a cultist mob, killed them off, putting to death the priests, priestesses, and cultists of Cain in the plaza. The prince upon Redclaw wiped out an outer tower and a section of wall, extensively hitting the Druki until, wounded by arrows, the Griffin was killed by Prince Gaharion. The lion chariots, led by their prince, killed Hydra, and the other Hydra's beastmasters got shot, whereupon it realized that was near a bunch of other monsters that were natural rivals and turned to attack them, ironically working with the Asur Knights to purge the monsters. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the wizards. Thyrol destroyed the tower's defenders with green fire, Myrnir shot red lightning off his staff to get rid of stone and defenders who got out of cover after his prince blasted, and the mages unleashed storms of blue and purple lightning, cast fiery convocation on many of the defenders, and evoked floating daggers of Heesh and conjured blades that killed cultists on the walls. This lightning and fire in particular was quite deadly and notable to Ulthuan. Still, many knights of Malekith's host and Yavresian spearmen were killed by the Manticore riding prince, and others fell to cultists and archers. In turn, also many were cut down by knights, and when the prince of the Nagarythe, Malekith, was unable to raise a barrier to defend his troops, he instead threw out a spiteful conjuration, launching needle-like darts to tear through his enemies. This is believed to be the first time that Malekith actually used a dar. The Manticore riding traitor prince and Malekith fought with spell and blade. Soon the traitor lost his mount to mutual destruction against Redclaw, and the rider, as well as Myrnir's blue flames and sword. On the ground, Ion was crippled, but as he lay there, the traitor hastily denounced Morathi. This cowardice and refusal to even stay the course of being a rebel disgusted Malekith, but he kept to his word and left the other elf maimed, not dead. Malekith then advanced into the palace. He made his way through the mockery of his people's dignity, then came upon Morathi. She used her powers to read his mind and beckon her 4 wizards. The prince killed them by making them lose control of their powers, and then dueled the Rogue Queen. Son and mother exchanged insults and deadly magic, the winds of fire, life, and show being just some of the sources of their contest of power. In the end, she was able to appear to defeat Malekith, even taking off his crown, and had definitely 2 opportunities to kill her child, but Morathi did not, wanting to force her son to become something she saw as greater. Both times, additionally, she made an error, once provoking him into a surge of power, and the other getting too close, whereupon her armored child punched her to the ground. The mightiest living wizard, perhaps she was, but her golden mockery of a dress was no armor. Then, tragically, Malekith was talked down from destroying Morathi, instead capturing her and asking the king to spare her. Morathi was locked in a cell where it was thought she would be contained away from the 8 winds. After this battle, as Anlec was returned to its rightful ruler, Galthier's containment force gave up after Morathi lost, and it seems likely overall that somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Druchii and probably at least 10,000 Asur died during the battle of Anlec, with an unknown number of civilians living in the city as well. About 20 years later, there was a sudden new uprising. Malekith fled from his homeland with just a few thousand soldiers. The king sent 20,000 troops to keep this new Nagarythe cultish away from his lands, and hundreds of soldiers were brought back to crack down on the cults. Of course, by then, unfortunately, Malekith had fallen. He poisoned Baal Shaner, the king, and slandered his memory at the war council held at the shrine of Asurian. Then the prince and his knights slaughtered many of the attendees, as well as any Phoenix Guard and clerics of Asurian, when his claim to become the new king was denied. The traitor Malekith then stepped into the blazing blue fire, sure that he would be divinely blessed as the new king. He was wrong. Unworthy betrayer that he was, the fire seared him, melting his armor and charring his flesh. It was all he could do to hurl himself out of the inferno to crash down onto the ground and lie still. His knights, including in the company at least 1 wizard who called a ship, then left. The carnage was blamed on an earthquake by the rogue elves. Morathi was soon freed, and the funeral for the king and his son, who was also murdered, this time at the island itself, comprised of the following. They were each carried upon a chariot, followed by 300 more chariots, 500 spearmen, and 500 riders. Thousands of Asur were there for the sad event, and tens of thousands came later. The sundering had begun. Now, we are left with the question as to the sizes and losses of both sides. In short, it can be estimated that about 72,000 to 90-odd thousand loyal High Elves, including at least 4 battle-relevant wizards, were used to bring down Morathi's rebellion, and maybe at least 27,000 soldiers died. The loss of civilians is unknown. The Druchii field armies probably, all told, comprised of about 75,000 to 100,000 soldiers, which, when taken with Anlec's defenders, brings the total to maybe 68,000 to 120,000, plus at least 6,000 cultists crushed in other lanes. Many monsters were also used. 7 wizards that are clearly known to have been among the Druchii can be identified, and estimated losses are maybe somewhere between 35 and 55,000 Druchii, at least 5 of them wizards, as well as all the monsters in Anlec, plus 6,000 cultists abroad. As ever, thank you for coming this far, and please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing. Have a wonderful day, and I hope you learned something.